There is a word in the Bible that appears more than 370 times, and almost every English translation has made it mean something it does not mean. The word is glory. When you hear it, you probably imagine something luminous, a golden haze, a radiant cloud, a shaft of light breaking through the ceiling of a sanctuary. You imagine something you can see, something bright, something that makes you feel small in a pleasant way, like standing at the edge of a canyon at sunset. That is not what the word means. It is not even close. The Hebrew word behind the English translation is kavod, and its root meaning has nothing to do with light. The root is kaved, which means heavy, weighty, substantial. A stone is kaved. A burden is kaved. A person who carries authority carries kavod. The word does not describe something that shines. It describes something that presses down, something that occupies space and demands that the ground beneath it acknowledge the weight it is carrying. When the Bible says the glory of the Lord appeared, it is not saying something became visible. It is saying something became present in a way that could be felt before it could be seen. The implications of this are enormous and almost entirely unconfronted in the average church. If glory is weight, then the presence of God is not a spectacle to be observed, but a gravity to be endured. The Israelites did not see the glory of God on Sinai and think, that was a beautiful light show. They saw it and thought, we are going to die. The ground shook. The mountain burned. The people backed away and told Moses they could not bear to hear the voice of God directly. That is the response to kavod. Not awe in the modern sense of being impressed, but awe in the ancient sense of being crushed. The weight of God was not a metaphor. It was an experience that had to be mediated because human beings cannot stand under it unshielded. And this raises a question that the rest of the biblical narrative is structured to answer. If the presence of God is that heavy, how does anyone survive it? How does a finite creature stand in the same space as infinite weight and not collapse? The Bible does not answer that question on Sinai. It waits, it builds, it lets the weight accumulate across centuries so that when the answer finally arrives, it lands with the force of something that has been pressing down since the foundation of the world. The problem is that we have spiritualized the word glory into something safe. We sing about it. We pray for it. We ask God to fill the room with it, as though it were a mood or an atmosphere that could make us feel better about our lives. But the biblical writers would have found that use of the word almost incomprehensible. When Isaiah saw the kavod of the Lord in the temple, he did not ask for more of it. He said, "Woe is me, I am undone." When Ezekiel saw it departing from the temple, he fell on his face. When the glory of God descended on the tabernacle, Moses could not enter. The pattern is consistent and unsettling. The closer the weight comes, the less the human being can stand. And yet the same people who could not stand in the presence of that weight were commanded to build a dwelling place for it. This is the central tension of the entire Old Testament system. The God whose weight cannot be contained asks his people to contain him. The tabernacle is not a solution to the problem of divine presence. It is a question disguised as a structure. How does the weight dwell among those who cannot bear it? The answer is not given in the blueprints. The answer is given in the blood. The Hebrew word kavod appears first in a story that has nothing to do with worship. It appears in the narrative of Jacob, long before the tabernacle, long before Sinai, before the law was ever given. Jacob has spent the night wrestling with a man at the ford of the Jabbok, and when the struggle ends he names the place Peniel, which means the face of God, because he has seen God face to face, and his life has been preserved. That preservation is the key. Jacob expected to die. He walked away limping but alive, and the language used to describe what he encountered carries the weight of kavod, even though the word itself is not spoken. The pattern is already forming. To encounter God directly is to encounter something that should destroy you, and the fact that you survive it is not a sign that the weight was less than you feared. It is a sign that something intervened between you and the weight. For Jacob, that something was the night itself, the wrestling, the prolonged struggle that ended not in annihilation, but in blessing. For Israel at Sinai, it was Moses standing between the people and the mountain. For the entire sacrificial system, it was the blood on the altar. Every screen, every veil, every mediating structure is an admission that the weight is too much and that something must absorb it before it reaches you. And that is where the present-day believer finds themselves in a strange position. You have been told that the glory of God is something you should want more of. You have sung songs asking for it to fall, for it to fill the room, for it to cover you. But what exactly are you asking for? If the biblical concept of glory is weight, then asking for more glory is asking for more pressure. It is asking for the presence of God to press harder against the limits of your creatureliness. That is not a comfortable prayer. It is not a prayer you pray lightly. The men and women in Scripture who encountered the glory of God did not walk away feeling uplifted. They walked away changed in ways that cost them something. A limp, a speech impediment, a life of exile, a death. The weight of God does not leave you where it found you. It displaces you. It reorients you. It redefines what you are capable of surviving. And the fact that we have turned that weight into a metaphor for emotional intensity is not just a theological error. It is a failure to take seriously what the text is actually saying about the kind of God we are dealing with. There is a figure from the 2nd century who understood this better than most modern theologians. His name is Irenaeus, and he was writing in what is now southern France, pastoring a congregation that was being torn apart by false teaching about the nature of God. Irenaeus had been a student of Polycarp, who had been a student of the Apostle John himself, so the lineage of his thinking ran straight back to the eyewitnesses. And in his great work against heresies, Irenaeus develops a concept that is nearly lost in the modern church. He says that the glory of God is a living human being, and that the life of a human being is the vision of God. He is not making a sentimental point about human potential. He is making a structural argument about what happens when the weight of God meets the creature who was designed to bear it. For Irenaeus, the problem is not that the weight of God is too heavy. The problem is that humanity has become too light. We have been hollowed out by sin, reduced to something that cannot hold the presence we were built to contain. And so the entire work of redemption, for Irenaeus, is a process of being reweighed, of being thickened, of being made capable again of bearing the kavod that we were created to carry. You can feel the weight of this when you read the descriptions of the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. The instructions are painstaking, almost obsessive. Every curtain, every clasp, every piece of acacia wood overlaid with gold is specified with a precision that modern readers find exhausting. But the exhausting detail is the point. The tabernacle is not being built to be beautiful. It is being built to be adequate. It must be strong enough to contain what is going to dwell in it. The materials matter not because God cares about interior design, but because the weight of His presence will destroy anything that is not constructed to specification. The gold, the wood, the linen, the cherubim woven into the curtains, all of it is a containment system for something that would otherwise tear through the fabric of creation. And at the center of that system is the most holy place, a cube of space where the weight would concentrate most intensely. Only one man could enter it, only once a year, only with blood, because the weight of God does not negotiate with the limits of human capacity. It either kills what cannot bear it or it is mediated by something that can. But there is a detail in the tabernacle instructions that almost every reader skips past and that changes everything. When the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle at the end of Exodus, Moses could not enter. The man who had stood on Sinai, who had spoken to God face to face, who had carried the tablets of the law down the mountain, that same man could not walk into the tent where the weight was dwelling. The presence was too dense. It occupied the space so completely that there was no room for Moses inside it. And that raises the question that the tabernacle was designed to leave unanswered. If Moses cannot enter, who can? If the mediator himself is excluded, then what hope is there for anyone else? The tabernacle was supposed to solve the problem of divine presence, but in the moment of its completion, it only deepened the problem. The structure was adequate. The weight came, and the weight filled the space so fully that the space became uninhabitable for the very people it was meant to serve. Something else would have to happen. Someone else would have to enter where Moses could not. And the entire history of Israel from that moment forward is the story of God preparing that someone, building toward a body that could hold the weight without being crushed, a temple that could contain the presence without collapsing. But that body was not built from acacia wood and gold. That body was not built from acacia wood and gold, and the difference between those two kinds of construction, one made of materials that can be measured and the other made of flesh that can suffer, is the difference between every religion that human beings have ever invented and the specific claim that Christianity makes about the world. The tabernacle was a container built to specifications that could be calculated. It was finite, it was replaceable, it could be rebuilt when it was destroyed. But the body that was coming could not be replaced. It could only be offered. And the weight that body was going to carry was not the weight of gold and linen, but the weight of every failure, every violation, every breach of covenant that had accumulated between God and his people since the garden. The tabernacle contained the presence. The body that was coming would have to absorb the absence. The prophets began to see this long before it happened. Ezekiel, sitting among the exiles by the river Chebar in Babylon, saw something that no Israelite had ever seen and that no Israelite had ever wanted to see. He saw the glory of the Lord leaving the temple. It lifted from the cherubim, it moved to the threshold, it stood over the mountain, and then it departed. The weight of God, the kavod that had filled the tabernacle and the temple, the presence that Moses could not approach, the density that had made the most holy place uninhabitable, that weight abandoned the building that had been built to contain it. And Ezekiel watched it go. The temple did not collapse when the glory left. It stood there, still beautiful, still functional, still staffed with priests performing their rituals. But the weight was gone. The building was a shell. The sacrifices were theater. The people went through the motions of worship while the reality they were worshipping had walked out the door, and no one could see it except the man by the river, who had been given eyes to perceive what was missing. This is the moment that explains more about the present condition of the church than most sermons are willing to confront. A building can be full of activity and empty of weight. A liturgy can be performed with perfect precision, and the kavod can be miles away, moving eastward toward a people who do not even know it is coming. Ezekiel saw this and tried to tell the people, but they could not hear him because they were too busy maintaining the forms. They assumed that because the temple was still standing, God was still there. They assumed that because the sacrifices were still being offered, the covenant was still intact. They assumed that presence was guaranteed by procedure, and they were wrong. The weight of God does not reside in institutions. It does not dwell in buildings because buildings were built for it. It dwells where it chooses to dwell, and it leaves when it is no longer welcome, and the people who mistake the shell for the substance are the last ones to notice that the weight has lifted. That is not an Old Testament problem. That is a human problem, and it repeats itself in every generation that confuses the forms of faith with the reality of God. The Hebrew word that Ezekiel uses for the departure is halak, the same word used for walking, for going on a journey. The glory of God walked out of the temple. It did not vanish. It did not evaporate. It moved deliberately, slowly, as though giving the people time to notice what was happening, and the direction it moved matters. It went east toward the Mount of Olives, toward the same direction from which the exiles had been taken. The weight of God was leaving the place where it had dwelled and going toward the place where his people were suffering. This is the first hint of the answer to the question the tabernacle had left unanswered. The weight does not stay where it is comfortable. It goes where it is needed. It leaves the building to find the broken. And that movement, that departure from the temple toward the exiles, is the pattern that will define everything that happens when the weight finally takes on human form. The glory of God does not wait to be visited. It travels, it walks, it limps, if necessary, toward the people who have lost it. There is a moment in the Gospels that is almost never read as a fulfillment of Ezekiel, and it changes everything when you see it. Jesus is entering Jerusalem from the east. He comes over the Mount of Olives. The crowds are shouting, the palm branches are waving, and Luke records that as Jesus approaches the city, he weeps over it. He says, "If you had known this day, what would bring you peace?" And then he says something strange. He says, "Your house is left to you desolate." The word he uses is the same word the Greek translation of Ezekiel uses for the departure of the glory. Jesus is not just predicting the destruction of the temple. He is announcing that the weight has left again. The building is still standing, the sacrifices are still being offered, but the presence has walked out the eastern gate and is now standing on the Mount of Olives in the person of a man who is about to be arrested. The temple is desolate because the glory is standing outside it. The weight of God has left the container and entered a body, and that body is walking toward the place where the weight will be tested to its absolute limit. The Greek word that the New Testament uses for glory is doxa, and it carries its own set of connotations that most English readers never feel. In classical Greek, doxa meant opinion, reputation, the estimation of others. It was a social word, a word about how a person was perceived by the people around them. When the Septuagint translators chose doxa to render the Hebrew kavod, they were making a theological claim that is easy to miss. They were saying that the weight of God and the reputation of God are the same thing. The heavy presence of God and the public estimation of God are not two separate categories. They are one reality. The weight of God is what God is known to be, and that means the glory of God can be diminished. It can be obscured. It can be misunderstood. The weight does not change, but the perception of the weight can be lost. And when the perception of the weight is lost, the people who are supposed to be carrying the reputation of God become indistinguishable from the people who have no weight at all. That is what happened to Israel in exile. That is what happened to the temple in the 1st century. And that is what happens to any community that has the forms of faith, but has lost the weight that gives those forms their meaning. You live in a time when the word glory has been emptied of its weight and replaced with a feeling. You have been trained to think of glory as something that happens in a worship service when the music reaches a certain intensity or the lights are dimmed at the right moment, but the biblical writers would not recognize that definition. For them, glory was not the emotional high point of a gathering. It was the reason the gathering existed at all. It was the reality that pressed down on the community and reshaped their lives around a center that was not them. And when the glory departed, the gathering became noise, the music became entertainment, the preaching became performance, the community became a social club with religious vocabulary. Ezekiel saw it happen. Jesus announced it happening again. And the question that hangs over every congregation that has ever gathered in the name of God is whether the weight is actually present or whether the building is still standing, but the presence has already walked out the eastern gate. There is a man named Polycarp who understood this with a clarity that only comes from facing the end of your life. He was the bishop of Smyrna in the middle of the 2nd century, an old man who had known the Apostle John personally. The Roman authorities came for him during a persecution, and they gave him a choice. Curse Christ, and you can live. Polycarp refused. They threatened him with wild animals. He did not flinch. They threatened him with fire. He said, "The fire you threaten burns for a moment and then goes out. There is a fire that burns forever, and I am not afraid of the one that ends." They lit the pyre. The flames surrounded him, and the eyewitness account of his death records that the fire did not consume him. It arched around him like a sail billowing in the wind, and the smell that came from the flames was not the smell of burning flesh, but the smell of baking bread. The Romans had to stab him to kill him, and when they did, so much blood poured out that it extinguished the fire around him. That is what happens when a human being is carrying the weight of God and the world tries to destroy them. The weight does not protect them from death, but it changes what death means. It changes what death accomplishes. Polycarp was not killed. He was offered, and the offering of a life that carries the kavod of God is the most dangerous thing that can happen to a society that has built its entire system on the assumption that the weight does not exist. The Romans thought they were eliminating a troublemaker. They were actually releasing a presence that no amount of imperial force could contain. The blood of Polycarp did not extinguish the church in Smyrna. It seeded it. Because when a person who carries the weight of God is poured out, the weight does not disappear. It spreads. It saturates. It occupies the ground that the blood touches. And that is exactly what happened when the weight finally entered a human body that was built to carry it all the way to the end. Jesus stood in the temple courts in the final week of his life and said something that the people who heard it could not possibly have understood. He said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." They thought he was talking about the building. He was talking about his body. And the reason he could say that is that the temple had always been a placeholder for a body. The tabernacle was a placeholder for a body. The entire system of containment was a prophecy of a human being who could hold the full weight of God without being destroyed by it, and who could be destroyed by the world without losing it. Jesus carried the kavod of the Father in a body that could bleed, that could hunger, that could thirst, that could die. He carried the weight into the garden where he sweat drops of blood. He carried it into the praetorium, where the soldiers mocked him. He carried it up the hill of the skull, where the nails went through his hands and his feet, and the weight pressed down on him until he could not breathe. And at the moment when the weight should have crushed him, when the gravity of every sin that had ever been committed and every failure that had ever been accumulated pressed against his lungs, he did not collapse. He gave up his spirit. He released it. He handed the weight over. The veil of the temple tore from top to bottom in that moment, and that tear is the most important architectural detail in the history of the world. The veil was the last barrier between the weight of God and the people who could not bear it. It was the final screen, the final mediation, the final statement that the most holy place was not accessible to human beings. And when Jesus died, that veil tore open not from the bottom where a human hand could have reached it, but from the top where only God could have pulled it. The barrier was removed. The weight was no longer contained. The kavod that had filled the tabernacle and departed from the temple and walked over the Mount of Olives in the person of Jesus was now released into the world through the broken body of the one who had carried it. The containment system was obsolete. The temple was finished. The body had done what the building could not. It had held the weight and then released it so that the weight could come to everyone who would receive it. You have been carrying something lighter than you were made for. You have been living with a version of God that can be managed, that fits inside your categories, that does not press against the limits of your life. And that version is not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is weight. He is the presence that Moses could not approach, and that Ezekiel watched depart, and that Jesus carried into death. And the reason the Spirit was sent after the resurrection was not to make you feel something. It was to make you heavy. It was to make you capable of bearing the same weight that Christ bore. Paul says that the Spirit is the down payment, the arrabon, the first installment of the inheritance that is coming. And the inheritance is not a place, it is a weight. It is the full measure of the glory that human beings were created to carry, and that sin made us too light to hold. The Spirit is the reweighing of the human soul. Every moment of obedience, every surrender, every death to self is a grain of weight being added to a life that has been hollowed out by the world. And the day is coming when the weight will be complete, when the body will be raised, when the temple that is you will finally be capable of containing the full presence of the God who made you for himself. You were not made to be light. You were made to be heavy. And the heaviest thing you will ever carry is the one who carried everything for you.